The morning sun cast long shadows across Riverdale's elm-lined streets. Thomas Washington adjusted the rearview mirror of his black Cadillac, his weathered hands moving with deliberate precision. In the reflection, he saw himself 72 years of dignity etched into every line on his face. His eyes, deep and contemplative, betrayed nothing of the storm that brewed beneath his composed exterior. 15 years. 15 years since he had received the call that shattered his world. 15 years of carefully constructing a life around an absence that never stopped feeling like a fresh wound. Today marked that anniversary, and Thomas was returning to the place where everything had begun and where everything had ended. On the passenger seat lay three items arranged with care: a bouquet of pristine white lilies, their petals glowing in the morning light; an old, well-worn black leather-bound book on the Constitution, its pages yellow with age and frequent handling; and a vintage fedora hat, its felt softened by decades of wear. Each object carried the weight of memory, of purpose. Thomas drove with the measured patience of a man who had spent a lifetime considering the implications of every action. He had been one of the youngest judges appointed to the Supreme Court, a fact that had both defined his life and, ironically, had been insufficient to protect what mattered most to him. As he crossed the town line, a sign welcomed him to Riverdale. He did not need the reminder. This place lived in his bones. Across town, in a modest suburban home, Michael Shepard stood in his kitchen police uniform, crisp and badge gleaming. At 43, he had the confident posture of a man comfortable with authority. 14 years on the Riverdale police force had taught him to trust his instincts. Today, he was passing that wisdom to his 17-year-old son, James, who sat at the breakfast table pushing scrambled eggs around his plate. Sarah, Michael's 16-year-old daughter, was engrossed in a thick law textbook, her dark hair falling across her face as she highlighted passages with methodical focus. "James," Michael said, pouring coffee into his travel mug, "you coming on the ride along today?" James glanced up, uncertainty flickering across his features. "I don't know, Dad. I have that presentation to finish for Monday." "What's it on again?" Michael asked, though his attention was divided between his son and the morning police bulletin on his phone. "Supreme Court Justice Thomas Washington," Sarah answered before her brother could. "James got assigned the most interesting subject in class, and he's wasting the opportunity." "I'm not wasting it," James protested. "I just don't see why everyone thinks he's such a hero. He's just another judge." Michael lowered his phone, fixing his son with a pointed look. "Washington isn't just another judge. The man helped reshape constitutional interpretation for a generation. And he grew up right here in Riverdale," Sarah added, not looking up from her book. "Came from nothing, worked his way through law school, and ended up on the highest court in the land. That's the American dream right there." "Still just a guy in a robe," James muttered. Michael shook his head. "Son, sometimes I wonder if you've learned anything from me. Come on the ride along. It'll be good for you to see what real police work looks like. Better than sitting around reading about it in books." He shot a pointed glance at Sarah, who ignored him. James sighed, recognizing defeat. "Fine. That's my boy," Michael said, clapping his son on the shoulder. "Katie," he called out to his wife. "We're heading out." Katie Shepard appeared in the doorway, her nurse's scrubs already on for her early hospital shift. "Drive safe," she said, giving Michael a quick kiss. "And you," she added, turning to James, "listen to your father. Police work isn't a game." "Yes, Mom," James said, resignation in his voice. As they headed for the door, Sarah looked up. "Dad, did you see the email from Principal Roberts about the new district policy on student interactions with law enforcement?" Michael paused. "What about it?" "They're requiring training for officers who come into schools now, after what happened in Millfield." Michael's jaw tightened. That was a completely different situation. Officer Harris had no choice but to restrain that kid. "Jordy, the kid was 15, and he was just reaching for his phone," Sarah countered. "Sarah, enough." Katie interjected, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Your father has a job to do, and it's not an easy one. Let's not start the day with this." Sarah pressed her lips together, but returned to her book. Michael and James headed out the door to the patrol car parked in the driveway. As they settled into the vehicle, Michael adjusted his mirror. First lesson of patrol awareness. You need to be aware of everything happening around you all the time. James nodded, looking out the window as the suburban landscape slipped by. Houses gave way to storefronts as they approached downtown Riverdale. Second lesson, Michael continued, threat assessment. This is something you develop over time, a feeling and instinct. How do you know who's a threat? James asked. Michael considered this as he slowed for a red light. You just know. It's in the eyes. The way they move. The way they react when they see a patrol car. He glanced at his son. You'll understand when you see it. The eyes of someone who's up to no good. They've got a certain look. James frowned slightly. What kind of look? Hard to explain, but there's a difference between nervousness and guilt, between caution and fear. People who have nothing to hide act differently from those who do. Michael tapped his temple. It's all about reading the signs. That's what keeps us safe out here. The patrol car moved through town, Michael pointing out potential trouble spots, explaining patrol patterns, detailing how to identify suspicious behavior. James listened occasionally, jotting notes in a small pad he'd brought along. See that guy there? Michael nodded toward a young man in a hoodie walking quickly along the sidewalk. Notice how he's keeping his head down, hands in his pockets. That's someone I'd keep an eye on. He's just walking, James observed. Maybe, or maybe he's trying not to be noticed. That's the kind of subtle thing you need to pick up on. They drove for another hour, Michael continuing his impromptu lesson on policing. As they turned onto Maple Street, a black Cadillac caught Michael's attention. It was moving slowly, almost too slowly, as if the driver was looking for something. Watch this, Michael said, straightening in his seat. See that car? Something's off. What's wrong with it? James asked, studying the Cadillac. It looked immaculate, certainly not suspicious to his untrained eye. Just a feeling, Michael replied, activating his cruiser's lights. Thomas saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror and felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He checked his speedometer. He was 5 miles under the limit. His turn signal had been activated well before his last turn. He had violated no traffic laws. Yet here they were. Again. With practiced movements, Thomas pulled over to the curb, positioning his car perfectly parallel to the sidewalk. He placed his hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2 clearly visible. The Constitution book on the passenger seat seemed to pulse with irony. He watched in the side mirror as the officer approached, one hand resting casually on his holster, a subtle gesture Thomas had observed countless times before. He noticed a younger face in the passenger seat of the patrol car, a trainee perhaps, or a ride-along. Another generation learning the unwritten rules. The officer tapped on the window. Thomas pressed the button to lower it, his expression carefully neutral. License and registration. The officer said, his tone clipped and professional. May I ask why I've been stopped? Officer, Thomas asked, his deep voice steady and measured. The officer, Shepard, according to his nameplate, paused slightly. You were driving erratically, sir. Seemed like you might be lost or impaired. Thomas didn't blink. I was driving 5 miles under the speed limit, Officer Shepard. I used my turn signal appropriately. I violated no traffic laws. He maintained eye contact, his gaze level and uncompromising. License and registration, please. Shepard repeated, a slight edge entering his voice. Thomas reached slowly for his wallet, narrating his movements. I'm reaching for my wallet in my inside jacket pocket. He extracted his license and reached for the glove compartment. Now I'm opening the glove compartment to retrieve my registration. He handed both items to the officer, who studied them with practiced scrutiny. Mr. Washington, Shepard said, his eyes flickering back to Thomas's face. Where are you headed today? I don't believe my destination is relevant to this stop, Officer Shepard. A flicker of irritation crossed Shepard's face. Just trying to establish if you're familiar with the area, sir. You were driving quite slowly. I'm very familiar with Riverdale, Thomas replied. I was driving carefully and within the legal limits. Shepard's gaze drifted to the items on the passenger seat. What's in the car with you today, Mr. Washington? Nothing that would be of concern to law enforcement. Mind if I take a look in your trunk? Thomas's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a deep, weary recognition. Officer Shepard, I require probable cause for you to search my vehicle. Driving under the speed limit does not constitute probable cause. Sir, if you have nothing to hide, I once wrote the legal opinion on the very statute you're attempting to apply to me right now. Thomas interrupted, his voice low but carrying a gravity that seemed to alter the air between them. I know precisely what it says and what it doesn't say about a black car driven by a black man. There was a beat of silence heavy with implication. Shepard's posture stiffened. Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle. On what grounds, officer? I have reason to believe there may be contraband in this vehicle. What would that reason be precisely? Shepard didn't answer immediately. His hand remained near his holster, his stance widening slightly. Step out of the vehicle, sir. Thomas held his gaze for a long moment. Then with deliberate slowness, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the car door. He emerged with the fluid dignity of a man who had stood before the highest court in the land, now standing on a suburban street being treated like a common criminal. Would you place your hands on the hood of the car, please? Shepard instructed. Thomas complied, his expression unchanged. As his palms met the warm metal of his Cadillac, he noticed the young man in the patrol car watching intently, eyes wide with uncertainty. Shepard patted him down with practiced efficiency. Now I'm going to check your trunk, Mr. Washington. Without a warrant or probable cause that would constitute an illegal search, Officer Shepard, Thomas said evenly, I do not consent. Sir, your uncooperative attitude gives me reason to be suspicious. Asserting my constitutional rights is not being uncooperative, officer. It is being American. A tense silence stretched between them. In the patrol car, James shifted uncomfortably, watching his father's face harden with each passing second. Pop the trunk, Mr. Washington, Shepard insisted. Thomas turned to face the officer, fully now standing straight, his height and presence suddenly commanding the space between them. Officer Shepard, I will not consent to an unlawful search. If you proceed, I will be filing a formal complaint and possibly a civil rights violation suit against you in the Riverdale Police Department. Shepard's face flushed slightly. He glanced back at his patrol car, aware of his son watching, then back to the imposing figure before him. Something in Washington's demeanor gave him pause, a certainty, a familiarity with authority that most traffic stops didn't exhibit. He looked down at the license again, studying it more carefully this time. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly as recognition dawned. Supreme Court Justice Thomas Washington. He had just pulled over and attempted to illegally search a Supreme Court justice. Shepard cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how dry it had become. I apologize for the misunderstanding, sir. You're free to go. He held out the license and registration, his hand not entirely steady. Thomas took his documents, his expression revealing nothing of the turmoil beneath. Officer Shepard, your badge number is 4472. I will remember it. It wasn't a threat, but a simple statement of fact. He returned to his car with measured steps, closed the door with quiet precision, and started the engine. As he pulled away, he adjusted his rearview mirror once more and caught a glimpse of Shepard standing motionless by the patrol car, watching him drive away. Back in the patrol car, Michael sat in stunned silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel, though they weren't moving. Dad! James's voice broke through his thoughts. What just happened? Michael swallowed hard. That was Justice Thomas Washington. The guy I'm doing my presentation on, James asked, his eyes widening. Why did you stop him? I thought, Michael began, then stopped. What had he thought exactly? That a well-dressed older man in an expensive car driving carefully was suspicious. I had a feeling something wasn't right. But nothing was wrong, James pointed out. He wasn't doing anything. Michael didn't answer immediately. The encounter replayed in his mind, each moment now colored by the knowledge of who he had been confronting. Sometimes you make judgment calls in this job, he finally said. They're not always the right ones. He knew the law better than you did, James observed. He's a Supreme Court Justice, James. Of course he knows the law. Michael started the car, his movements mechanical. Let's continue patrol. But as they drove, Michael's thoughts remained with the encounter. Why had he really pulled Washington over? What instinct had he been following? The questions nagged at him, unwelcome and persistent. Thomas arrived at Riverdale Cemetery just as the morning fog was lifting. The grounds were empty, save for a lone groundskeeper in the distance, riding a mower across the rolling green expanse. Thomas parked near the eastern section and gathered his items from the passenger seat, the lilies, the book, the fedora. He walked the familiar path to a modest headstone beneath a young oak tree. The marble was simple, elegant, Marcus Washington, 1995-2010. His justice lives on. Thomas knelt slowly, placing the lilies at the base of the stone. He set the Constitution book beside them, and finally, with reverence, placed the fedora atop the book. "Hello, son," he said quietly. "I've come back as I promised." The cemetery remained silent except for birdsong and the distant hum of the mower. Thomas sat on the small bench he had installed years ago, facing his son's grave. "I encountered something today that reminded me of our last conversation." He continued, his voice low but clear. "You asked me why the law seemed to protect everyone except people who look like us. I told you then that the law was imperfect because those who enforce it are imperfect, but that we must continue to believe in its potential." He paused, his eyes fixed on the headstone. "I wonder now if that was the right answer. If perhaps I should have told you the harder truth that sometimes the system doesn't see us as it sees others. That sometimes, despite all our achievements, all our contributions, we remain invisible until we become threats." A gentle breeze stirred the petals of the lilies. "You were reaching for your phone," Thomas whispered, pain cracking through his carefully maintained composure. "Just reaching for your phone to call me, to tell me you were on your way home." He closed his eyes, allowing himself this rare moment of unveiled grief. When he opened them again, his gaze fell on the Constitution book. "I've spent my life interpreting these words, defending them, believing in them. I've tried to make them real for everyone, not just those they were originally written to protect. I've tried to be the change from within." He sighed, a deep, weary sound. "I wonder if it has made any difference at all." Thomas sat in silence for a long while, the weight of 15 years of absence pressing down on him. Eventually, he stood his knees, protesting the movement. "I miss you, Marcus. Every day." He touched the top of the headstone gently. "I'll be back tomorrow before I leave town again." As he turned to go, he noticed a figure standing at a respectful distance, a young woman with dark hair watching him with undisguised interest. She looked vaguely familiar, though he couldn't immediately place her. Thomas nodded acknowledgement, then walked back to his car, leaving the offerings at his son's grave. The fedora caught the midday sun, casting a long shadow across the marble stone. Sarah Shepard had recognized Justice Washington immediately. Her law books were filled with his opinions, his philosophies, his dissents. Seeing him in person, especially in such a private moment, felt intrusive, yet she couldn't bring herself to leave. When he nodded to her, she nearly gasped. Then, gathering her courage, she approached the grave after he had driven away. She read the inscription, noting the dates with a pang of realization. Marcus Washington had died young, only 15. She wondered what had happened, how a Supreme Court justice had lost his son. Sarah noticed the items left at the grave, symbolic, intentional. The Constitution book particularly caught her attention. She didn't touch anything but knelt to examine it more closely. It was worn in a way that spoke of constant use of reverence. As she stood to leave, she noticed something small glinting in the grass near the bench. Bending down, she found a silver badge, not a police badge, but something official-looking, with the scales of justice embossed on it. It must have fallen from Justice Washington's pocket as he sat. Sarah picked it up, turning it over in her hand. On the back was an inscription, "To Justice Washington, with gratitude for your testimony. Committee on Judicial Reform, 2005. She pocketed it, intending to return it if she saw him again. As she walked back to her bicycle, her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "Coming home early. We need to talk." Michael Shepard sat in the station parking lot, unable to bring himself to go inside. The encounter with Washington had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. He kept replaying it in his mind, searching for justification for the threat he had supposedly sensed. But there had been nothing. Just an older black man driving carefully through town. Michael had always prided himself on his fair-minded approach to policing. He wasn't like some of the older officers who openly made comments about certain neighborhoods or certain types of people. He treated everyone with the same professional courtesy, or so he had believed. Yet when he had seen Washington's car, something had triggered his suspicion. What was it? The expensive car, the slow driving. The fact that the driver was black. The question made him deeply uncomfortable. His phone chimed with a notification. A text from Katie. Sarah just called, said she saw Justice Washington at the cemetery. Did something happen today? Michael closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. News traveled fast in Riverdale. By tomorrow, everyone would know about his encounter with the justice. He started the car again and headed home, rehearsing explanations in his mind, none of which seemed adequate. The Shepherd home was quiet when Michael arrived. Katie was still at work, but Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her law book spread out around her. She looked up when he entered, her expression unreadable. "Where's James?" Michael asked, setting his keys on the counter. "Upstairs, working on his presentation." Sarah's tone was neutral, but her eyes were sharp with unasked questions. Michael nodded, moving to the refrigerator to get a beer. "You saw Justice Washington today?" "At the cemetery," Sarah confirmed. "Dad, did you really pull him over?" Michael took a long swallow of beer before answering. "Yes, it was a mistake." "A mistake?" Sarah echoed, her voice carefully controlled. "What kind of mistake?" "I thought—" Michael began, then shook his head. "I had a feeling something wasn't right. It's part of the job, Sarah. Sometimes you have to make split-second decisions based on instinct." "What instinct told you to stop Justice Washington?" she pressed. "It wasn't about who he was. I didn't know it was him." "That's not what I asked." Michael felt a flare of irritation. "I don't have to justify my professional decisions to you, Sarah. No, just to the police review board if he files a complaint." Sarah closed her book with deliberate calm. "I found something at the cemetery." She reached into her pocket and placed the silver badge on the table. It was near the bench by his son's grave. Michael picked up the badge, examining it. His son, Marcus Washington, died in 2010. He was 15. Sarah watched her father's face carefully. "Did you know Justice Washington had a son who died young?" "No," Michael admitted. He set the badge down, suddenly uncomfortable with holding it. "What was Washington doing in Riverdale anyway? He hasn't lived here in decades." "Today is the anniversary," Sarah said quietly. 15 years. It was on the headstone. Michael felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had pulled over a father visiting his son's grave on the anniversary of his death. The magnitude of his misstep began to dawn on him. "I should return this to him," Sarah said, taking the badge back. "Do you know where he's staying?" "No, and you're not going to bother him." Michael's tone was firm. "If he's still in town tomorrow, I'll return it myself." Sarah looked like she wanted to argue, but was interrupted by James coming downstairs. "Dad," he said, his expression troubled. "I need to talk to you about what happened today." Michael sighed, feeling suddenly exhausted. "James, it was a misunderstanding. These things happen in police work." "But you taught me to look for certain signs of suspicious behavior," James persisted. "Justice Washington wasn't showing any of those. He was just driving." "It's more complicated than that," Michael began. "Is it?" Sarah interjected. "Or is it exactly that simple?" The tension in the room was broken by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. A moment later, Katie entered, still in her nurse's scrubs. "What's going on?" she asked, sensing the atmosphere immediately. "Michael, I've been getting texts all afternoon about you pulling over Justice Washington. Is that true?" Michael looked from his wife to his children, feeling suddenly cornered in his own home. "Yes, it's true. I didn't know who he was. I made a judgment call that turned out to be wrong." "But why did you make that call?" James pressed. "That's what I don't understand." Michael set his beer down harder than intended. "Enough, I've been a police officer for 14 years. I've made thousands of traffic stops. Sometimes you get it wrong." End of story. He left the kitchen, retreating to his home office and closing the door firmly behind him. Once alone, he sank into his chair, the day's events weighing heavily on him. On his desk was a framed photo of him receiving his badge, fresh-faced and idealistic. Beside it was a more recent picture of his family, James and Sarah, flanking him and Katie, all smiling. Michael opened his laptop and typed "Marcus Washington death" into the search bar. The results appeared immediately: news articles, obituaries, and later retrospectives. "Son of Supreme Court Justice dies in police shooting." Michael felt the blood drain from his face as he clicked on the article. Marcus Washington, 15, son of then newly appointed Supreme Court Justice. Thomas Washington was fatally shot by police officer Raymond Miller in Riverdale on May 28, 2010. According to police reports, Washington was stopped while walking home from a friend's house. When he reached for his cell phone, Officer Miller, believing he was reaching for a weapon, fired 3 shots. Washington was pronounced dead at the scene. The shooting sparked national outrage and renewed debates about police use of force, particularly against young black men. Michael couldn't read further. He closed the laptop and buried his face in his hands. 15 years to the day, and Michael had stopped Justice Washington for nothing more than driving while black in the very town where his son had been killed by a police officer. The magnitude of what he had done settled over him like a shroud. Thomas Washington sat in his hotel room, gazing out at the Riverdale skyline. The town had grown since he had lived here, but the essential character remained unchanged. This place had shaped him, nurtured his early ambitions, witnessed his greatest loss. His phone rang, a Washington, D.C. number he recognized. "Washington," he answered. "Thomas, it's Eleanor. I heard about what happened today." Eleanor Hayes, a fellow justice and longtime friend. News traveled fast, even across state lines. "Word travels quickly," Thomas observed. "A Supreme Court justice being racially profiled in his hometown?" "Of course it does." Eleanor's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Tell me what happened." Thomas recounted the incident with detached precision, as if delivering a summary of court proceedings. "Will you file a complaint?" Eleanor asked when he finished. "No." "Thomas, a complaint changes nothing, Eleanor. It becomes a statistic in a report that no one reads. Another black man claiming mistreatment easily dismissed. You're not just another black man, Thomas. You're a Supreme Court justice. And yet on that street to that officer, that's exactly what I was." Thomas's voice remained calm but carried an undercurrent of deep weariness. "Nothing has changed in 15 years, not really." Eleanor was silent for a moment. "I'm so sorry, Thomas. Today of all days." "Perhaps it's fitting," Thomas said quietly. "A reminder of why I do what I do, why I must continue." "What can I do?" Eleanor asked. Thomas considered this. "Nothing for now, but I may have an idea forming, something more meaningful than a complaint." After ending the call, Thomas returned to the window. The sun was setting over Riverdale, casting long shadows across the town that had given him so much and taken even more. He thought of the young woman at the cemetery, her curious, intelligent eyes, her respectful distance. There had been something familiar about her, though he couldn't place it. Thomas reached into his pocket for his judicial reform badge, a small token he had carried for years as a reminder of promises made and not yet fulfilled. It was gone. He searched his other pockets, then remembered sitting on the bench at Marcus's grave. It must have fallen there. Thomas sighed. Some things were lost, others merely misplaced, and some had to be deliberately set aside to make room for what might come next. He opened his briefcase and removed a legal pad. At the top, he wrote in his precise handwriting, "If justice must see color before it can act, is it justice at all?" He stared at the words for a long time, then began to write. A crosstown officer, Raymond Miller, now chief of police. Raymond Miller sat in his office reviewing the day's incident reports. A knock at his door interrupted his reading. "Come in," he called. Michael Shepard entered, still in uniform, his expression troubled. "Shepard," Miller greeted him. "Heard you had quite the encounter today. Chief, I need to talk to you about what happened." Miller gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit down and relax. It was an honest mistake. Washington's not going to file a complaint." "How do you know that?" Michael asked, taking the offered seat. "Because I know Washington. He doesn't operate that way." Miller leaned back in his chair. "He believes in working within the system, changing things from the inside. Always has. Even after what happened to his son." The question slipped out before Michael could consider its implications. Miller's expression hardened slightly. "That was 15 years ago, Shepard. A tragic accident that was thoroughly investigated and resolved." "You were the officer involved," Michael said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, and I was cleared of any wrongdoing." Miller's tone made it clear the subject was closed. "Look, Shepard, you made a judgment call today. It didn't pan out. But no harm done right. Washington drove away. End of story." Michael shifted uncomfortably. "It wasn't right, Chief. I had no reason to stop him. You had your instincts. Those count for something in our line of work. But what if my instincts were wrong? What if they were based on something I'm not proud of? Miller studied him for a moment. Shepard, let me give you some advice. Don't overthink this. We make dozens of decisions every day out there. Some work out, some don't. The important thing is that we're keeping this community safe. Are we, though? Michael pressed. If we're stopping law-abiding citizens for no reason, one mistake doesn't define your career, Miller interrupted firmly. Don't let this incident throw you off your game. You're a good officer, Shepard. One of my best. Don't forget that. Michael nodded slowly, though the reassurance felt hollow. What happens now? Nothing happens. No complaint, no investigation, no record. Miller picked up a folder from his desk. I've already spoken with the department legal advisor. Since there was no citation issued and no official report filed, there's nothing to add to our records. He met Michael's gaze directly. This incident never officially occurred, Shepard. Let it go. Michael left the chief's office with a growing unease. The conversation had done nothing to settle his doubts. If anything, it had deepened them. As he walked through the station, he noticed officers glancing his way, conversations quieting as he passed. Word had spread, as it always did. Outside, the evening air was cool against his face. Michael stood for a moment, looking up at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. His phone buzzed with a text from Katie. Dinner's ready when you are. The kids want to talk. Michael sighed, pocketing his phone. He wasn't ready for more questions, more scrutiny of a decision he himself was beginning to question deeply. But some conversations couldn't be avoided forever. As he drove home, the radio reported on a vigil being planned for tomorrow evening, the 15th anniversary of Marcus Washington's death. Community leaders were expecting Justice Washington to attend, though he had made no public statement. Michael turned off the radio, preferring silence to the reminder of what the day truly signified. In the darkness of his patrol car, away from the watchful eyes of his chief, his colleagues, his family, Michael finally asked himself the question he had been avoiding all day. Would he have stopped Thomas Washington if he had been white? The answer came with uncomfortable clarity, and Michael drove the rest of the way home in silence, the weight of recognition settling over him like a shadow. Sarah sat cross-legged on her bed, the silver badge in her palm reflecting the soft light of her bedside lamp. She had researched Justice Washington extensively for a school project last year, but somehow had never learned about his son. Now she couldn't stop reading about Marcus Washington, his promising academic career, his interest in constitutional law, like his father, his death at the hands of a police officer who had mistaken a cell phone for a weapon. And that officer was now Chief Raymond Miller, her father's boss. The connections were dizzying, almost overwhelming. Today, 15 years later, her own father had stopped Justice Washington without cause, perpetuating the very system that had taken his son. Sarah closed her laptop and stared at the badge again. The Committee on Judicial Reform 2005. 5 years before Marcus died. What testimony had Washington given? What reforms had he advocated for? Had any of them been implemented? Had anything changed? She thought of her father, his absolute certainty in his own judgment, his unwavering belief in the system he served. She had always admired his conviction, even when she questioned his perspectives. Now she wondered if that conviction was blinding him to something fundamental. Sarah placed the badge carefully on her nightstand and picked up her copy of Washington's most famous dissenting opinion, a passionate argument against overly broad police powers that had nearly become the majority view. Reading his words now with the knowledge of his personal tragedy gave them new weight, new meaning. The Constitution's protections mean little if they are applied selectively, if they shield some citizens while leaving others exposed. Equal protection under the law is not merely an aspiration, it is a mandate, a promise America makes to each of its citizens. When we fail to fulfill that promise, we diminish not only those who are denied protection, but the very foundation of justice itself. Sarah read the passage again, then again. Justice Washington had written this 3 years after his son's death, his grief transformed into a powerful call for true equality under the law. Tomorrow she decided she would find a way to return the badge to him, And perhaps in doing so, she might begin to understand how justice could exist alongside such profound loss. Thomas Washington stood at the window of his hotel room watching the lights of Riverdale twinkle in the darkness. In his hand was a small frame photograph of Marcus smiling bright-eyed, full of promise. "I saw something today that would have made you laugh, son," Thomas said softly to the image. History repeating itself, the same assumptions, the same biases, the same failures of perception. He set the photograph on the nightstand and sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly feeling every one of his 72 years. "I've spent 15 years trying to change the system from within, trying to make your death mean something, trying to ensure that no other father would feel this pain." He closed his eyes. "I wonder if I've made any difference at all." The question hung in the air, unanswered. Thomas Washington, one of the most powerful jurists in the country, sat alone in a hotel room in the town where his son had died, confronting the limits of his influence, the persistence of the very injustice he had dedicated his life to fighting. Tomorrow would mark 15 years exactly. 15 years since he had received the call that changed everything. 15 years of carefully measured words of strategic dissents, of incremental progress. 15 years of absence that never stopped feeling like a fresh wound. Thomas opened his eyes, his gaze falling on the legal pad where he had been drafting something new, not a judicial opinion or a dissent, but something more personal, more direct. Perhaps it was time for a different approach. Perhaps silence properly deployed could speak more loudly than any written word. Thomas Washington, Supreme Court Justice, father, widower, survivor, picked up his pen and continued to write the words flowing with the weight of 15 years of grief, of purpose, of unwavering commitment to a promise made at a graveside. Outside his window, Riverdale slept unaware that the next day would mark not just a solemn anniversary, but the beginning of something unexpected. Something that would force a community to confront what it had too long ignored. The unavoidable gaze of justice, looking directly at those who claim not to see color, even as their actions proved otherwise. Dawn broke over Riverdale with a gentle, persistence light spilling across the cemetery where a small crowd had already gathered. The 15th anniversary of Marcus Washington's death had drawn community leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens touched by the tragedy that had unfolded here all those years ago. Thomas Washington stood apart from them, a solitary figure beneath the oak tree that had grown tall and strong over his son's grave. He had arrived before sunrise, before the others, needing these private moments to fortify himself for what was to come. The white lilies from yesterday had been joined by dozens of other flowers offerings from people who had never known Marcus, but who carried his story with them, a cautionary tale, a call to action. Thomas knelt to straighten a bouquet that had tipped in the morning breeze. His movements were precise, unhurried. Time had long since ceased to rush for him. A woman approached her footsteps, hesitant on the dewy grass. Thomas recognized her as Riverdale's Mayor, Evelyn Carter. "Justice Washington," she said softly, "on behalf of our city, I want to express our deepest, thank you, Mayor Carter." Thomas interrupted, his tone courteous but firm. "I appreciate the sentiment." She seemed momentarily taken aback by his brevity, but nodded in understanding. "The memorial service will begin in an hour. We've arranged for you to speak if you wish." Thomas rose to his full height, brushing invisible dust from his immaculate suit. "I won't be speaking today." "Oh," her surprise was evident. "I thought perhaps you might want to address the community, share your thoughts on how far we've come since—" "Have we come far, Mayor Carter?" Thomas asked, his gaze steady. The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable. Mayor Carter shifted uncomfortably. "The memorial service will proceed as planned," she finally said. "Your presence alone is meaningful to many people here." Thomas nodded once, then turned back to his son's grave. The dismissal was clear, and the mayor retreated, leaving him to his private communion with the dead. Across town, Michael Shepard sat at his kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He hadn't slept well. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Thomas Washington's face, that impassive dignity, masking what Michael now recognized as a deep, contained pain. Katie entered the kitchen, already dressed for her hospital shift. She paused when she saw him. "You're up early," she observed, moving to pour her own coffee. "Couldn't sleep," Michael admitted. Katie sat across from him, studying his face. You're still thinking about yesterday. It wasn't a question, but Michael nodded anyway. I keep trying to understand why I did it, why I stopped him. You said it was instinct. Katie reminded him, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. That's what scares me, Michael said quietly. What if my instincts are wrong? What if they've always been wrong? Katie reached across the table to touch his hand. Michael, you're a good cop. You've always tried to do the right thing. Have I? He finally met her gaze. I've been thinking about all the traffic stops I've made over the years. How many of them were based on nothing more than a feeling of suspicion with no real foundation? That's part of police work, isn't it? Following your gut. But what informs that gut feeling, Katie? What if it's something I've never wanted to admit to myself? She withdrew her hand slowly. What are you saying, Michael? He drew a deep breath. I'm saying that I stopped Justice Washington because he was black. Not because he was doing anything wrong. Not because there was any legitimate reason. Just because he was a black man in an expensive car, and something in me found that suspicious. The admission hung between them raw and uncomfortable. Michael, Katie began, then stopped clearly, unsure how to respond. I've always told myself I'm not like that. Michael continued, his voice strained. That I don't see color, that I treat everyone the same. But yesterday proved that's not true. One mistake doesn't define you, Katie said, echoing Chief Miller's words from the previous day. It's not just one mistake, though, is it? Michael pushed back his chair and stood pacing the small kitchen. It's a pattern I've never acknowledged. And the worst part is, I've been teaching that same pattern to James. Dad? James's voice came from the doorway. He stood there in his pajamas, hair tousled from sleep, watching his father with concern. Is everything okay? Michael looked at his son, his pride, his legacy, the young man he had been so eager to shape in his own image. No, he admitted. Everything is not okay. Sarah Shepard had risen with the sun, determined to find Justice Washington before the memorial service began. The silver badge weighed in her pocket as she pedaled her bicycle toward the Riverdale Grand Hotel, where she had learned he was staying. The hotel lobby was quiet at this early hour. Sarah approached the front desk with as much confidence as she could muster. I need to speak with Justice Thomas Washington, please, she said to the clerk, a middle-aged woman with skeptical eyes. I'm sorry, but we can't disturb our guests or confirm who's staying with us. The clerk replied, professional but firm. Sarah had anticipated this. It's important. I found something that belongs to him. She showed the silver badge, careful not to fully release it from her grasp. The clerk's expression softened slightly. I can call up to his room if he's available. Thank you, Sarah said, relieved. My name is Sarah Shepard. The clerk picked up the phone, dialed, and spoke quietly. After a moment, she covered the receiver. He's asking if you're related to Officer Michael Shepard. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. He's my father. The clerk relayed this information, then listened for a response. Justice Washington will see you. Room 5112. Sarah thanked her and headed for the elevators, her heart beating faster. What would she say to him? How could she possibly address what her father had done? The elevator doors opened on the 5th floor, and Sarah made her way down the hushed corridor. At room 512, she paused to gather her courage, then knocked softly. The door opened to reveal Thomas Washington, fully dressed in a dark suit despite the early hour. He regarded her with those penetrating eyes she had glimpsed at the cemetery. Miss Shepard, he said, his deep voice neutral. You have something of mine. Sarah nodded suddenly, finding it difficult to speak. She withdrew the badge from her pocket. I found this at the cemetery yesterday, by your son's grave. Washington's expression didn't change, but he extended his hand to receive the badge. As he took it, his fingers brushed hers briefly, an ordinary human contact that somehow felt significant. Thank you, he said, examining the badge before slipping it into his pocket. You were at the cemetery yesterday. Yes, sir. I recognized you from my textbooks. I'm studying constitutional law. A flicker of interest crossed his face. At your age, I'm planning to apply to law school after college, Sarah explained. Your opinions have been influential for me. Washington studied her for a moment, as if seeing beyond her nervous exterior to something deeper. You have questions, he observed. It wasn't a question, but Sarah nodded anyway. I do. But I also want to apologize for what my father did. It was wrong. Your father was following his training. Washington replied, his tone revealing nothing of his personal feelings. No, Sarah said firmly. He was following something worse than his training. And I'm sorry. Washington's expression softened almost imperceptibly. You're not responsible for your father's actions, Miss Shepard. I know, but still. She met his gaze directly. I also wanted to ask about Marcus. Washington went very still. What about my son? I read about what happened to him, that he was killed by a police officer who thought he was reaching for a weapon when he was just getting his phone. Sarah's voice grew quieter. The officer who shot him is now the chief of police, my father's boss. Raymond Miller. Washington confirmed, his voice steady, despite the weight of the name. Yes, I'm aware of his promotion. How can you come back here? Sarah asked the question, bursting from her, before she could consider its propriety. How can you face this town, these people, after what happened? Washington was silent for a long moment, considering her, with those deep, thoughtful eyes. Then he gestured to the door. Would you walk with me, Miss Shepard? I find conversation flows more easily in movement. Surprised, Sarah nodded. Of course. They exited the hotel together, an unusual pair. The distinguished older jurist and the earnest teenage girl walking side by side through Riverdale's quiet morning streets. To answer your question, Washington said after they had walked half a block in comfortable silence, I returned because absence solves nothing. Riverdale is where my son lived, where he died, and where the work of justice remains unfinished. But doesn't it hurt being here? Of course it hurts, he replied simply. Pain is not the enemy, Miss Shepard. Indifference is. They continued walking their pace unhurried. Sarah found herself measuring her steps to match his longer stride. After Marcus died, Washington continued, I had a choice. I could withdraw from the world, or I could engage with it more deeply. I chose the latter. I still believe that systems can change from within if those within them are willing to confront uncomfortable truths. Like the truth that my father stopped you because you're black, Sarah said quietly. Washington nodded. Like that truth, yes. I don't understand how you can be so calm about it. What would anger accomplish that silence cannot? He glanced at her. Sometimes, Miss Shepard, the most powerful response is no response at all. Just presence, bearing witness. They had reached a small park. Washington gestured to a bench, and they sat watching early morning joggers pass by. The memorial service is today, Sarah said after a moment. Will you speak? No, Washington replied. I will be there, but I will not speak. Why not? People would listen to you. They've had 15 years to listen, Miss Shepard. Today I want them to see. He turned to face her fully. Your father saw a black man in a car and stopped him without cause. Chief Miller saw a black boy with a phone and shot him without hesitation. Seeing, truly seeing, is the first step toward change. Sarah absorbed this, turning the concept over in her mind. But if you don't speak, how will people know what you want them to see? Washington's lips curved in the barest suggestion of a smile. That, he said, is the question that matters most. The video appeared online just before noon. Someone had recorded Michael's traffic stop of Justice Washington from a nearby porch, the entire encounter, from the moment the patrol lights activated to Washington's dignified departure. The footage was clear, unambiguous, damning in its simplicity. By the time Michael arrived at the station for his shift, the video had been viewed thousands of times. His phone had been buzzing nonstop with notifications. The station was unnaturally quiet when he entered. Conversations ceased. Colleagues averted their gazes. Michael made his way to his desk, aware of every eye following him, every whispered comment. Chief Miller appeared at his office door. Shepard, a word. Michael followed him into the office, closing the door behind him. Miller was already pulling up the video on his computer. Have you seen this? He demanded. Yes, sir. Miller studied him, his expression hard. This complicates things. Ah, yes, sir, Michael repeated, standing stiffly beside the desk. I told you yesterday this was a non-issue, that there would be no record. Miller gestured to the screen. Now it's public. Now everyone's talking about it. I understand, sir. Do you... Miller leaned back in his chair. Because this isn't just about you anymore, Shepard. This reflects on the entire department. On me. Michael met his chief's gaze. What would you like me to do, sir? Damage control. We need to get ahead of this narrative before it spirals further. Miller pulled out a notepad. I've arranged an interview with Channel 7 News this afternoon. You'll explain your actions, emphasize that you were following protocol, that you had reasonable suspicion. But I didn't, Michael interrupted. Miller stared at him. Excuse me, I didn't have reasonable suspicion. Not really. Michael swallowed hard but continued. I stopped Justice Washington because he was a black man in an expensive car, and something in me found that suspicious. Nothing more. The silence that followed was deafening. Miller's face flushed red, then pale. Are you out of your mind? He finally said, his voice dangerously low. You can't say that on camera. It's the truth. The truth. Miller stood abruptly. The truth is that you're a police officer doing your job. The truth is that split-second decisions are part of that job. The truth is that we protect this community by being vigilant, by trusting our instincts. Even when those instincts are wrong, even when they're based on bias, Miller's jaw tightened. You need to get your head on straight, Shepard, fast. Because if you go on camera and say what you just said to me, you're not just throwing away your career, you're undermining this entire department. Michael felt a strange calm settling over him. Maybe the department needs some undermining, sir. Maybe we all need to take a hard look at how we're doing our jobs. This isn't about some abstract concept of justice, Shepard. This is about real-world policing in a real-world community. A community where Justice Thomas Washington's son was shot and killed for reaching for his phone. Michael said quietly, by you. Miller went very still. That case was investigated and closed. I was cleared of any wrongdoing. Were you? Michael held his gaze. Or was it just easier for everyone to accept that version of events? To not ask the hard questions? You're on thin ice, Shepard. I know. Michael straightened his shoulders. But for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm standing on solid ground. Miller stared at him for a long moment, then reached for his phone. Go home, Shepard. You're suspended effective immediately pending a review of this incident. Michael nodded unsurprised. He removed his badge and gun, placing them on the desk with deliberate care. The memorial service is this afternoon, he said as he turned to leave. I'll be there. Don't, Miller warned. You'll only make things worse. Michael paused at the door. Worse for whom, sir? He left without waiting for an answer, walking through the station with his head held high, despite the weight of the gases following him. Outside, the bright midday sun momentarily blinded him. When his vision cleared, he noticed a small crowd had gathered across the street, people, with phones recording, witnessing. In that moment, Michael Shepard understood what it meant to be seen, truly seen, perhaps for the first time. Sarah returned home to find her mother in the kitchen, her expression troubled as she stared at her phone. Mom, what's wrong? Katie looked up startled. Sarah, where have you been? I returned something to Justice Washington. Then we talked. Sarah noticed her mother's reddened eyes. What happened? Katie handed over her phone. On the screen was the video of her father stopping Washington's car. Sarah watched it, her stomach tightening at the familiar movements of her father, the dignified responses of the justice. It's everywhere, Katie said. Everyone's seen it. Has Dad? Yes. He's been suspended, Sarah. He just called me. Sarah set the phone down, processing this. Because of the video. Because of what he said to Chief Miller afterward. Katie's voice wavered slightly. He told the truth, Sarah, about why he stopped Justice Washington. He admitted it was racial profiling. Sarah said not a question, but a confirmation. Katie nodded. He's on his way home now. I don't know what happens next. Sarah thought of her conversation with Washington, his words about silence and witnessing. He'll be at the memorial service, she said. Justice Washington. I don't think your father should go, Katie said quickly. It would only make things more complicated. Maybe complicated is what we need right now, Sarah countered. Maybe we've all been avoiding the complicated truth for too long. Katie studied her daughter with new eyes, as if seeing something unexpected emerging. When did you get so wise? I'm not wise, Sarah said. I'm just tired of pretending. I think Dad is too. The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted them. A moment later, Michael entered, his uniform conspicuously absent, replaced by civilian clothes. Katie went to him immediately, wrapping her arms around him. Are you okay? I'm fine, he assured her, though his voice lacked conviction. He noticed Sarah watching him. Hey, kiddo. I saw the video, Sarah said simply. Michael nodded, unsurprised. Everyone has. I talked to Justice Washington this morning. I returned something he lost at the cemetery. Michael looked startled. You, what, Sarah? You shouldn't have. He was kind, Dad. We talked about Marcus, about what happened 15 years ago. Sarah held her father's gaze. About what happened yesterday. Michael sank into a kitchen chair, suddenly looking exhausted. What did he say? That systems can change from within if people within them are willing to confront uncomfortable truths. Sarah sat across from him. He's not going to speak at the memorial service. He's just going to be there watching, witnessing. Michael absorbed this, his expression thoughtful. And what do you think I should do? The question surprised Sarah. Her father had never asked for her opinion on matters of such significance before. I think, she said carefully, that you should be there too. Not to speak, just to witness. Michael nodded slowly. And Chief Miller. He'll be there making a speech about progress and community healing. Then you'll both be confronting the truth in your own ways, Sarah said. Him by hiding it, you by facing it. Michael looked at his daughter with new respect. When did you get so wise? Sarah smiled slightly, echoing her earlier response to her mother. I'm not wise, I'm just tired of pretending. Eleanor Hayes arrived in Riverdale just after lunch, her academic demeanor belied by the fire in her eyes. She found Thomas Washington in his hotel room, meticulously preparing for the memorial service. Thomas, she greeted him, embracing him briefly. I came as soon as my lectures were done. You didn't need to come, Eleanor, he said, though his expression suggested he was glad for her presence. Of course I did. She set her bag down and studied him. I've seen the video. It's everywhere. I know. And you're still not speaking at the service? No. Eleanor nodded, understanding her old friend well enough to know that his decision was final. Then what's the plan? You must have one. Washington gestured to a stack of papers on the desk. I've been collecting data, incident reports, traffic stops, arrest records. All public information, though not easily accessible. Eleanor examined the papers. Racial disparities in policing. In Riverdale specifically. Yes, over the past 15 years. Since Marcus died, Eleanor noted softly. Washington nodded. I've compiled it all. The patterns are illuminating. And what do you intend to do with this information? Nothing, Washington replied. But Professor Eleanor Hayes, noted legal scholar and advocate for judicial reform, might find it valuable for her research. Eleanor's lips curved in a knowing smile. I see. And might Professor Hayes be planning to share this research with, say, the press, or perhaps with certain community organizations? That would be entirely at her discretion. Washington said, his expression impassive, though his eyes held a spark of purpose. Consider it done. Eleanor gathered the papers, tucking them into her bag. But Thomas, is this enough after 15 years of silence, of working within the system? The time for silence as acquiescence is over. Washington interrupted. Now is the time for silence as confrontation, for holding up a mirror rather than pointing a finger. Eleanor considered this. And Officer Shepard, the one who stopped you, he's been suspended, I hear, for telling the truth about why he stopped me. Does that satisfy you? Washington looked out the window at Riverdale spread below. This isn't about satisfaction, Eleanor. It's about transformation. Not just of policies or procedures, but of hearts and minds. A tall order, she observed. Yes, he agreed, but not an impossible one. By mid-afternoon, the video had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. National news outlets had picked it up, running headlines about a Supreme Court justice racially profiled in his hometown. Social media buzzed with outrage, with calls for accountability, with demands for change. And in Riverdale, people began to gather. The memorial service was scheduled for 4 p.m. at the city park near a small monument erected in Marcus Washington's memory years earlier. By 3 p.m., the crowd had swelled beyond all expectations. Community members stood shoulder to shoulder with visitors from neighboring towns, with activists who had traveled hours to be present with journalists, eager to capture whatever might unfold. Sarah arrived with her parents, James, trailing behind them. The family moved through the crowd, aware of the stares, the whispers, the phones recording their progress. Michael walked with his head high, though the strain showed in the tightness of his shoulders, the clench of his jaw. Near the front, a space had been reserved for dignitaries, the mayor, city council members, community leaders. Chief Miller stood among them, resplendent in his dress uniform, his expression carefully composed for the cameras that frequently turned his way. As Michael approached, Miller's gaze found him. A silent communication passed between them, recognition, warning, defiance. Then another ripple moved through the crowd as Thomas Washington arrived, Eleanor Hayes at his side. The justice moved with unhurried dignity, nodding acknowledgments but speaking to no one. He took his place in the front row directly across from where Chief Miller stood. The mayor stepped to the microphone, calling for silence. Today we gather to remember Marcus Washington and to reflect on how far we've come as a community in the 15 years since his tragic death. Her words continued, well practiced and politically careful, threading the needle between acknowledgement and accountability. Thomas Washington sat motionless, his gaze fixed not on the mayor, but on Chief Miller, who steadfastly avoided meeting his eyes. Other speakers followed, community leaders, clergy activists, each offering their perspective on progress made and challenges remaining. Through it all, Washington remained silent, watchful, a presence that seemed to grow more powerful with each passing moment. When Chief Miller took the microphone, a hush fell over the crowd. 15 years ago, a tragedy occurred in our community. He began, his voice steady and authoritative. A split-second decision made in the line of duty had devastating consequences. As the officer involved, I have carried that day with me ever since. He paused, sweeping his gaze across the gathering, careful to avoid Washington's unwavering stare. But today is not about reopening old wounds. It's about celebrating how far we've come, about the reforms we've implemented, the training we've enhanced, the community relationships we've built. Today is about looking forward, not backward. Sarah, standing with her family at the edge of the reserved section, felt a surge of indignation at the chief's sanitized version of events. She glanced at her father, saw the muscle working in his jaw, the conflict in his eyes. Then something unexpected happened. Thomas Washington stood. He made no move toward the microphone, offered no words of challenge or correction. He simply stood tall and dignified, his gaze locked on Chief Miller. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The chief faltered mid-sentence, then attempted to continue. Washington remained standing silent, watchful. Then slowly Eleanor Hayes stood beside him. Then a woman near the back of the crowd. Then a man to Washington's right. One by one, people throughout the gathering rose to their feet until nearly half the crowd was standing in silent witness, their gazes fixed on Chief Miller as he struggled to maintain his composure at the podium. Sarah felt the power of the moment, the silent confrontation more eloquent than any words could have been. She stood, her heart pounding. After a moment's hesitation, James stood as well. Katie looked at her children, then at her husband, uncertainty in her eyes. Michael met his wife's gaze, something resolving in his expression. Then he too rose to his feet, standing not in support of his chief, but in witness against the system they both served. Chief Miller's words trailed off as he confronted the sea of standing observers, their silence more damning than any shout of protest. His eyes finally met Washington's, and in that moment something passed between them. Recognition perhaps, or reckoning. The chief abruptly stepped away from the microphone, returning to his seat with rigid dignity. The mayor rushed to fill the awkward void, calling the next speaker, but the damage was done. The carefully choreographed narrative had been disrupted by nothing more than silence and witness. As the service concluded, people began to disperse, talking in hushed, urgent tones about what they had witnessed. News cameras captured it all, the silent standing, the chief's retreat, the power of wordless confrontation. Thomas Washington made his way through the crowd, accepting handshakes and embraces with quiet grace. When he reached the spot where the Shepherd family stood, he paused. "Officer Shepherd," he acknowledged, his voice betraying no emotion. Justice Washington, Michael replied, meeting his gaze directly. I want to apologize officially and publicly for yesterday's incident. It was wrong. Washington studied him for a moment. Acknowledgement is the first step, Officer Shepard. What will be your second? Before Michael could respond, Chief Miller approached, his expression tight with controlled anger. Justice Washington, he said stiffly, I hope today's service provided some measure of closure. Closure? Washington repeated the word, hanging between them. Is that what you think this is about, Chief Miller? Closing a chapter, moving on. Miller's jaw tightened. It's been 15 years, Justice Washington. Our department has implemented numerous reforms since then. And yet, Washington said quietly, yesterday one of your officers stopped me for no reason other than the color of my skin. Some things, it seems, remain unchanged. That was an isolated incident, Miller insisted. One officer's mistake for which he has been suspended. He glanced at Michael with barely concealed contempt. No, Michael said suddenly. It wasn't isolated, and it wasn't a mistake, it was a pattern, one I've been part of for years without acknowledging it. Miller turned on him fully now. Shepard, you're already suspended. Don't make this worse for yourself. I think, Eleanor Hayes interjected, stepping forward with quiet authority, that Officer Shepard is making it better not just for himself, but for this entire community. And who exactly are you? Miller demanded. Professor Eleanor Hayes, she replied, extending her hand, which Miller reluctantly shook. Legal scholar, advocate for judicial reform, and as of this afternoon, lead researcher on a comprehensive study of racial disparities in Riverdale's policing practices over the past 15 years. Miller's face paled slightly. What study? Eleanor smiled, a sharp expression with no warmth. The one based on public records that reveal some rather troubling patterns. The one I'll be discussing at a press conference tomorrow morning. The one that asks a rather pointed question. How many people must remain silent for one person to be unjustly suspected? The chief's expression hardened. You're talking about disrupting a functioning police department based on cherry-picked statistics and a personal vendetta. No, Thomas Washington said, speaking with the quiet authority that had swayed Supreme Court decisions. We're talking about holding a mirror up to a system that has refused to see its own reflection for far too long. The tension between them was palpable, drawing attention from bystanders, from journalists hovering nearby with cameras and microphones. This isn't the place for this discussion, Miller said, lowering his voice. We should take this somewhere private. Why? Sarah asked, suddenly stepping forward. So it can be hidden away again, like my father's incident report would have been if someone hadn't recorded it. Miller glared at her. Young lady, this doesn't concern you. It concerns all of us. She countered, her voice steady despite her racing heart. That's the point, isn't it, Justice Washington? That silence only works when everyone agrees to it. Washington regarded her with quiet approval. Precisely, Miss Shepard. A reporter approached, microphone extended. Chief Miller, would you care to comment on the allegations that Officer Shepard was suspended for admitting racial bias in stopping Justice Washington? Miller's expression closed like a fist. No comment at this time. The department will issue an official statement tomorrow. As he turned to leave, his gaze fell on Michael once more. Shepard, if you have any sense of loyalty left, you'll keep quiet until the official investigation is complete. My loyalty, Michael replied, is to justice. I'm beginning to understand that might not be the same as loyalty to the department. Miller's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing more, departing with rigid dignity through the dispersing crowd. When he was gone, Washington turned to Michael. That was a courageous stand, Officer Shepard. Not compared to yours, Michael said. 15 years of working within a system that took your son. I can't imagine that strength. We each find our courage when we're ready for it, Washington replied. Some sooner, some later. The important thing is that we find it at all. He extended his hand and Michael took it, a simple gesture that spoke volumes about the possibility of reconciliation, of progress, of change. As they parted, Eleanor touched Washington's arm. Thomas, there's something you should see. She showed him her phone, where a news alert displayed a leaked audio recording from the Riverdale Police Department. The headline made Washington's breath catch. Leaked police chief ordered officers stop of justice. Washington removed from records. The recording spread like wildfire. Chief Raymond Miller's voice clear and unmistakable. Shepard's stop of Washington doesn't go in the system. It will skew our successful resolution rates. This stays off the books. Am I clear? An unidentified officer. Yes, sir. But isn't that against department policy? Miller. Department policy is what I say it is. This incident never happened. End of discussion. By evening, the story had evolved from a single incident of racial profiling to evidence of systematic cover-ups within the Riverdale Police Department. National news outlets descended on the small-town cameras, capturing the growing crowds outside police headquarters, the hastily called emergency meeting of the city council, the mayor's ashen face as she promised a full and transparent investigation. Thomas Washington watched it unfold from his hotel room, Eleanor Hayes at his side. "Did you know about the recording?" she asked. "No," he admitted. "But I'm not surprised by its contents. This changes everything, Thomas. Miller can't survive this." Washington nodded slowly. "Perhaps, but removing one police chief doesn't change a culture. It doesn't address the deeper issues." "No," Eleanor agreed. "But it creates an opening, a moment when real change might be possible." Washington turned from the window to look at his old friend. "Do you remember what you said to me after Marcus died, when I was considering declining the Supreme Court nomination? I told you that you could do more good on the bench than off it," Eleanor recalled. "That systems change when good people work within them to bend the arc toward justice." "And I've tried to do that," Washington said quietly. "For 15 years, I've written opinions, issued dissents, advocated for reforms. But yesterday, when Officer Shepard stopped me for no reason other than the color of my skin, I wondered if anything had changed at all." And now Washington considered the question. "Now I wonder if change happens not through grand gestures or sweeping reforms, but through individual moments of courage. Officer Shepard admitting his bias, his daughter questioning the system she was raised to respect, the people standing in silent witness today." Eleanor smiled slightly. "The personal and the political intertwined as always." "Yes." Washington picked up the silver badge Sarah had returned to him that morning, turning it over in his hand. "The Committee on Judicial Reform gave me this after I testified about racial disparities in our legal system. They thanked me for my insights, promised to implement my recommendations." "And did they? Some. Not enough." He set the badge down. "Perhaps it's time to try a different approach." Sarah sat on her bed scrolling through news updates on her phone. The leaked recording had transformed the narrative, completely shifting focus from her father's actions to Chief Miller's attempt to cover them up. A knock at her door interrupted her reading. James entered, his expression troubled. "Hey," he said, hovering awkwardly in the doorway. "Can we talk?" Sarah nodded, making space for him on the bed. "What's up?" James sat fidgeting with the sleeve of his sweatshirt. "I've been thinking about everything that happened. About Dad and Justice Washington and all of it." "Me too. I was there, Sarah, in the patrol car when Dad stopped him. I saw it happen and I didn't say anything." Sarah studied her brother's face, seeing the guilt etched there. "What could you have said? Dad's the officer. You were just along for the ride." "I could have questioned him afterward. I could have pointed out that Washington wasn't doing anything wrong." James shook his head. "But I didn't, because part of me accepted Dad's explanation, that he had a feeling and instinct. We were both raised to trust those instincts," Sarah said quietly, "to respect the badge of the system. But the system is broken." James said the words seeming to surprise even him. "Or at least parts of it are." "Yes." They sat in silence for a moment, siblings united in a painful recognition. "I don't think I want to be a cop anymore." James finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I used to think it was all about protecting people, serving the community. But now you see it's more complicated," Sarah finished for him. James nodded. "How do I tell Dad?" "I think," Sarah said carefully, "that Dad might understand better than you expect. He's changing too." "Hey, do you think things will ever really change? The whole system, I mean." Sarah thought of Washington's quiet dignity, of her father's courageous admission, of the people standing in silent witness at the memorial service. "I think change happens person by person, moment by moment," she said, "and maybe that's the only way it can happen." James considered this, then nodded slowly. I'm going to finish my presentation on Justice Washington, but I think it's going to be different from what I originally planned. How so? Less about his court opinions, more about his life, about Marcus. James met his sister's gaze. About what it means to seek justice when the system has failed you. Sarah smiled slightly. I think Justice Washington would approve. Michael sat at the kitchen table staring at his badge and gun, which Katie had collected from the station. His suspension was official now, administrative leave, pending a full investigation of both the traffic stop and Chief Miller's attempt to suppress it. Katie sat across from him, her expression a complex mixture of concern and pride. What happens now? She asked. I don't know, Michael admitted. The department will investigate. The mayor's appointed an independent commission. There will be hearings, testimonies. And you'll tell the truth, Katie said. It wasn't a question. Yes, all of it. Michael looked up at his wife. It might cost me my job, Katie. I know. Are you okay with that? With the uncertainty, the potential financial impact, the community backlash? Katie reached across the table to take his hand. Michael, when I married you, I believed I was marrying a man of integrity, someone who would always try to do the right thing even when it was difficult. Today you proved me right. Michael squeezed her hand, emotion welling in his throat. I've been blind, Katie. For so long I've been blind to my own biases, my own participation in a system that treats people differently based on the color of their skin. We all have blind spots, Katie said gently. The question is what we do when they're revealed to us. Justice Washington asked me that today, what my second step would be after acknowledgement. Michael's gaze drifted to his badge on the table. I'm still figuring that out. Their conversation was interrupted by a news alert on Michael's phone. He picked it up, reading with growing disbelief. What is it? Katie asked. Chief Miller has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation, Michael said, and the mayor has appointed an interim chief. Who? Michael looked up, his expression stunned. Captain Lisa Johnson, the department's first black female captain, Katie noted. That's significant. It's a start, Michael agreed. A small one, but a start. His phone buzzed again, a text message from an unknown number. Officer Shepard, I would appreciate the opportunity to continue our conversation. Perhaps tomorrow at the cemetery. 10 a.m. St. Washington. Michael stared at the message, a mixture of trepidation and hope stirring within him. What more could he possibly say to the man whose dignity had exposed Michael's own prejudice? What conversations could bridge the gulf between them, between what the system was and what it should be? Yet in the invitation itself lay a seed of possibility, a chance not just for personal redemption, but for something larger, more meaningful. I'll be there, Michael texted back. As he set the phone down, he felt for the first time in days the weight on his shoulders lighten somewhat. Not because the path ahead was clear, it wasn't, but because he was finally facing in the right direction. Outside, the Shepherd home, reporters had begun to gather, drawn by the unfolding story of a police officer who had admitted his own bias, who had stood against his chief, who had chosen truth over loyalty to a flawed system. Inside, a family was grappling with uncomfortable revelations, with shattered certainties, with the painful process of growth. And across town, Thomas Washington stood at his hotel window, gazing out at the city where his son had lived and died. The silver badge rested in his palm, a reminder of promises made and broken, of systems resistant to change, of the long, difficult road toward justice. Yet for the first time in 15 years, he felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. Not the grand, sweeping hope of transformation overnight, but the quiet, resilient hope of incremental progress, of individual moments of courage, of truth breaking through the comfortable silence of complicity. Tomorrow he would meet with Officer Shepard. Dawn painted Riverdale in gentle gold as Thomas Washington made his way to the cemetery. The morning air carried the crisp promise of renewal, though Thomas knew better than most how tenuous such promises could be. 2 days had passed since the memorial service. 2 days of media frenzy, of community meetings, of passionate debates about policing, about bias, about justice. Through it all, Thomas had maintained his deliberate silence, speaking only when necessary and to those who mattered. Today would be different. Today he would speak to Michael Shepard. The cemetery was quiet at this early hour. Thomas followed the familiar path to Marcus's grave, where fresh flowers had accumulated offerings from strangers moved by the unfolding story that had captured national attention. He sat on the bench arranging his thoughts as carefully as he arranged the bouquet he had brought. Some conversations required precision, and this would be one of them. At precisely 10 a.m., Michael Shepard appeared walking slowly up the path. He wore civilian-clothes jeans, a button-down shirt, a light jacket. Without his uniform, he seemed both more approachable and more vulnerable. "Justice Washington." He greeted, his voice respectful but strained. "Officer Shepard," Thomas acknowledged. "Thank you for coming." Michael glanced at the headstone discomfort evident in his posture. "I feel like I'm intruding." "Marcus doesn't mind visitors," Thomas said simply. "Please sit." Michael hesitated, then took a seat on the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a long moment, neither spoke, the weight of their shared history, both recent and distant, filling the space between them. "I've been trying to understand," Michael finally said, his gaze fixed on the ground before him, "why I did what I did, why I stopped you that day." "And have you found an answer?" Michael nodded slowly. "Not one I'm proud of, but yes." He looked up, meeting Thomas's steady gaze. "I saw a black man in an expensive car driving slowly through town, and something in me, something I've never wanted to acknowledge, found that suspicious." "Implicit bias," Thomas observed, his tone neutral. "Yes." Michael's voice grew quieter. "The worst part is I've been teaching that same bias to my son, telling him about instincts and feelings that are really just prejudice dressed up as professional judgment." Thomas absorbed this, his expression unchanging. "Recognition is the first step, Officer Shepard, but it's only the first." "I know. That's why I'm here." Michael straightened his shoulders slightly. "I want to make this right. Not just with you, but with the community, with the department. I just don't know how." Thomas was silent for a moment, considering. "Why did you become a police officer, Mr. Shepard?" The question seemed to surprise Michael. "I wanted to help people, to protect them, to serve my community." "Admirable motivations," Thomas acknowledged. "And in your 14 years of service, do you believe you fulfilled those goals?" Michael's expression clouded. "I thought I had. Now, I'm not so sure. Because I'm realizing that I haven't been protecting everyone equally, that my idea of suspicious has been selective." Michael shook his head, frustration evident. "I've tried to be a good cop. I've never used excessive force. I've never planted evidence. I've never knowingly broken the law. And yet," Thomas said quietly, "you stopped me without cause." "Yes. And how many others before me? How many stops, how many searches, how many moments of unwarranted suspicion that were never captured on video, never brought to light?" Michael had no answer, his silence an admission in itself. Thomas shifted slightly, turning to face him more directly. "Officer Shepard, I don't say these things to condemn you personally. The problem is far larger than any individual officer." "The system," Michael said. "Yes. A system that trains officers to trust instincts without examining the biases that inform them. A system that rewards certain kinds of enforcement while ignoring the costs. A system that protects itself at the expense of those it claims to serve." Michael nodded slowly. "Chief Miller tried to keep my stop of you out of the records. He said it would skew our successful resolution rates. I didn't understand what that meant until yesterday." "What happened yesterday?" "I went through my own records, all my traffic stops, all my arrests over the past 5 years. Michael's voice grew strained. "The pattern was unmistakable. I've been stopping black and brown drivers at more than twice the rate of white drivers, for the same infractions, sometimes for no infraction at all. And the arrests, similar disparities." Michael met Washington's gaze directly. "I've been part of the problem for years, without ever admitting it to myself." Thomas studied him, seeing the genuine distress in his eyes. "What do you intend to do with this recognition, Officer Shepard?" "I don't know," Michael admitted. "I've been suspended. There's an investigation underway. My career might be over. And if it isn't, if you're reinstated..." Michael considered this the question clearly one he had been wrestling with. I think I need to be part of changing the system from within, using what I've learned, what I've recognized in myself. Thomas nodded slowly, something like approval flickering in his eyes. An admirable goal, but change from within requires more than good intentions. It requires courage, persistence, and a willingness to be uncomfortable perhaps for the rest of your career. I know. Do you? Thomas's voice sharpened slightly. My son was reaching for his phone, Officer Shepard, just his phone, to call me to tell me he was on his way home. That's all. The pain usually so carefully contained edged into his voice. And Officer Miller now, Chief Miller shot him 3 times because he saw a threat that existed only in his mind, in his instincts, in his bias. Michael flinched at the rawness of Washington's words. I can't imagine your pain, he said softly, and I can't change what happened to Marcus. No, Washington agreed, his composure returning. You can't. No one can. But perhaps you can help ensure it doesn't happen to someone else's son, someone else's father. How? Washington reached into his pocket and withdrew the silver badge Sarah had returned to him. This was given to me after I testified before the Committee on Judicial Reform in 2005, 5 years before Marcus died. I recommended comprehensive changes to police training, to use of force policies, to accountability mechanisms. He handed the badge to Michael, who took it with obvious uncertainty. They thanked me, Washington continued, praised my insights, promised implementation, then filed my recommendations away and continued business as usual. Michael turned the badge over in his hand, reading the inscription. Committee on Judicial Reform 2005. Yes, a committee that had the power to change things but lacked the will, the courage. Washington's gaze was steady, penetrating. I've kept that badge as a reminder of promises made but not kept, of the gap between acknowledgement and action. Why are you giving it to me? Michael asked. Because perhaps it's time for someone else to carry that reminder, someone in a position to act on it. Michael looked down at the badge, then back at Washington. I don't know if I can live up to what you're asking. Neither do I, Washington said simply, but I believe in the possibility. That's something I haven't felt in a very long time. He rose from the bench, indicating that their conversation was concluding. Officer Shepard, I don't offer forgiveness easily. It's not a gift to be given, but a process to be earned through actions, through change, through persistence. I understand, Michael said, standing as well. But, Washington continued, I believe forgiveness is the beginning, not the end. The beginning of the hardest work we do as human beings, the work of transformation, of reconciliation, of justice that heals rather than simply punishes. He extended his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Michael took it, the handshake, firm, brief, meaningful. My daughter believes in you. Washington said, a hint of warmth entering his voice for the first time. She has her mother's insight, her ability to see beyond surfaces. That counts for something in my estimation. Michael looked surprised. You knew Sarah's mother. Professor Grace Montgomery, Washington confirmed. We taught at the same law school briefly before my appointment to the bench. A brilliant mind, a compassionate heart. Your daughter takes after her. Before Michael could process this unexpected connection, Washington nodded a farewell and walked away, his tall figure silhouetted against the morning sun. Michael remained by Marcus's grave, the silver badge heavy in his palm, not with physical weight, but with the weight of responsibility, of possibility, of the difficult path that lay ahead. When Michael returned home, he found the house empty except for Katie, who sat at the kitchen table reviewing hospital charts. How did it go? She asked, setting aside her work. Michael sat across from her, placing the silver badge on the table between them. It was clarifying, he said after a moment. In what way? He didn't offer forgiveness, Katie, not explicitly, but he offered something, maybe more important, a chance to make things right. Not just with him, but with the whole system. Katie reached across the table to take his hand. That's a big responsibility. Yes, Michael agreed. And I'm not sure I'm up to it, but I have to try. What about your job? The suspension? Michael sighed. I don't know. There's a hearing scheduled for next week. The department, the mayor's office, the community oversight board, they're all involved now. It's bigger than just me. Because of the leaked recording, Katie noted, and because of what I admitted afterward. About my pattern of stops my biases. Michael squeezed her hand. I might lose my badge, Katie. Permanently. Would that be so terrible? The question surprised him. What do you mean? Katie met his gaze directly. I mean, maybe there are other ways to create change. Other paths forward that don't involve returning to a system that might resist the very changes you want to make. Michael considered this, turning the possibility over in his mind. Maybe, but Washington seems to believe change can happen from within if someone has the courage to push for it. And do you have that courage? I don't know, Michael admitted, but I want to find out. Their conversation was interrupted by the front door opening. Sarah entered, her expression brightening when she saw her father. You're back, she said. How was your meeting with Justice Washington? Michael gestured to the chair beside him. Come sit. I want to tell you something about your mother. Eleanor Hayes stood before a packed conference room at Riverdale Community College, her academic demeanor belied by the passion in her voice as she presented her findings. These statistics tell a clear and troubling story, she said, gesturing to the projected graphs behind her. Over the past 15 years, black drivers in Riverdale have been stopped at 3 times the rate of white drivers. They've been searched at 5 times the rate, despite contraband being found less frequently than in searches of white drivers. The audience, a mix of community members, activists, journalists, and local officials, absorbed the information with murmurs of concern and nods of recognition. But perhaps most troubling, Eleanor continued, is what happened after these stops. When we requested records for our research, we discovered significant gaps incidents that officers reported in their daily logs, but that never made it into the official department database. She clicked to the next slide, which displayed a comparison of log entries versus database records. In short, the Riverdale Police Department has been systematically removing certain incidents from their official records, specifically incidents where stops of minority drivers yielded no arrests, no citations, no contraband. The very stops that would negatively impact their successful resolution rates. The murmurs grew louder, more indignant. This is not merely a clerical issue, Eleanor emphasized. It's a deliberate distortion that masks the true extent of biased policing in this community. It creates an illusion of effective, unbiased law enforcement while hiding the reality experienced by many Riverdale citizens. From the back of the room, a voice called out, "And what do you propose we do about it, Professor Hayes?" Eleanor smiled slightly, having anticipated the question. I'm glad you asked. Today we are launching the Unanswerable Questions Project, a community-based initiative to address systemic bias in policing through data dialogue and concrete policy changes. She clicked to the final slide, which displayed the project's first formal question in bold letters. How many people must remain silent for one person to be unjustly suspected? This question, Eleanor explained, gets at the heart of our challenge. Bias thrives in silence. The silence of those who experience it, the silence of those who witness it, the silence of those who perpetuate it. Breaking that silence is the first step toward meaningful change. As the presentation concluded and the room erupted in applause, Eleanor noticed Thomas Washington standing quietly at the back, observing without drawing attention to himself. She made her way through the crowd to join him. Powerful presentation, he commented as she reached him. Thank you. Though the data did most of the work, Eleanor studied her old friend's face. How was your meeting with Officer Shepard this morning? Productive, Thomas replied. He's at a crossroads, recognizing his biases, questioning his role in the system. And you believe he's sincere? Thomas considered this. I believe he's genuinely disturbed by what he's discovered about himself. Whether that disturbance translates to meaningful action remains to be seen. You gave him the badge, Eleanor observed, noting its absence from Thomas's pocket where it had resided for years. Yes, it seemed appropriate. A gesture of forgiveness? Thomas shook his head slightly. Not forgiveness, possibility. The beginning of a harder process, not its conclusion. Eleanor nodded in understanding. Speaking of beginnings, the first community dialogue session is scheduled for tomorrow evening. Will you attend? I'll be there, Thomas confirmed, though I may not speak. Your presence alone has power, Eleanor acknowledged. As we saw at the memorial service. As they talked, a young woman approached hesitantly. Sarah Shepard, her expression a mixture of determination and uncertainty. Justice Washington, she greeted, then turned to Eleanor. Professor Hayes, that was an incredible presentation. Thank you, Miss Shepard, Eleanor replied warmly. Your father mentioned you're interested in constitutional law. Yes, Sarah confirmed, and in systems change, which is why I'm here actually. She took a deep breath. I'd like to volunteer with the Unanswerable Questions Project. If you're accepting student volunteers. Eleanor glanced at Thomas, whose expression revealed nothing. We are, she said after a moment, though I should warn you it might create some complications for your family given your father's position. My father and I have talked about it, Sarah said. He supports my involvement even if it's uncomfortable, especially if it's uncomfortable. She straightened her shoulders slightly. He says change doesn't happen in comfortable spaces. Thomas's lips curved in the barest suggestion of a smile. Your father is learning quickly. He is, Sarah agreed, and so am I. The Shepherd house had become unnaturally quiet over the past few days. James spent most of his time in his room, emerging only for meals. His expression troubled his usual banter, absent. Katie worked longer hospital shifts, throwing herself into the familiar routines of patient care, where her competence was unquestioned. Michael devoted hours to reviewing his past records, confronting the patterns he had never allowed himself to see before. And Sarah divided her time between school home and her new volunteer position with the Unanswerable Questions Project, returning each evening with fresh insights, challenging questions, renewed purpose. 3 days after Michael's meeting with Washington, James finally broke his silence at dinner. I've decided something, he announced, setting down his fork. I'm not going to apply to the police academy after graduation. Michael looked up, studying his son's face. Okay, he said simply. What changed your mind? James seemed surprised by the calm acceptance. Everything that's happened, what you did, what you admitted. He hesitated, then continued. I always thought being a cop was about protecting people, about doing what's right. But now I see it's more complicated than that. It is, Michael agreed. And if you've decided it's not the right path for you, I respect that. You're not disappointed, Michael considered this. I wanted you to follow in my footsteps because I was proud of the work I did. Now I'm questioning that work myself. How could I be disappointed in you for asking the same questions? James nodded slowly, relief evident in his posture. I think I want to study history instead, or maybe political science, something that helps me understand how systems work, how they can be changed. That sounds like an excellent path, Katie said, reaching over to squeeze her son's hand. It does, Michael agreed. Systems need change from without as well as within. Maybe you and Sarah will end up working on the same issues from different angles. Sarah smiled at her brother. Structural reform meets grassroots activism. We could be a powerhouse team. The tension that had permeated the house for days seemed to ease slightly as they continued their meal, the conversation flowing more naturally than it had since the fateful traffic stop. Later, as Michael loaded the dishwasher, his phone rang, an unknown number. Michael Shepard, he answered. Officer Shepard, this is Mayor Carter. Do you have a moment to talk? Michael straightened, surprised. Yes, Mayor. What can I do for you? I've been reviewing the situation with the police department carefully, she said, her tone measured. The leaked recording, your statements about bias in your own policing, Professor Hayes's research findings. It's clear that we're facing a systemic issue, not just isolated incidents. I agree, Michael said cautiously. In light of this, I've made some decisions. Chief Miller has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Captain Johnson has been appointed interim chief, and the City Council has approved the formation of a police reform task force to address the issues Professor Hayes identified. Michael absorbed this information. That sounds like positive movement, Mayor. It's a start, she acknowledged, but for it to succeed, we need participation from all stakeholders, community members, police officers, legal experts, people who understand the problems from multiple perspectives. Michael began to see where the conversation was heading. And you're calling me because you're in a unique position, Officer Shepard. You've acknowledged your own biases. You've been willing to speak uncomfortable truths, and you have 14 years of experience in the department. I'd like you to serve on the task force." The request caught Michael off guard. "Mayor Carter, I'm currently suspended, under investigation myself." "I'm aware," she said, "and that suspension remains in place for now. But your perspective would be valuable precisely because you've been willing to confront your own role in the system, to acknowledge where it's broken and where you've been broken along with it." Michael was silent for a moment, considering the implications. Would Chief Miller also be on this task force? "No," the mayor said firmly. "This isn't about individual redemption, Officer Shepard. It's about structural change. Are you interested?" Michael thought of Washington of the Silver Badge, now sitting on his dresser of the challenge the justice had implicitly issued. "Yes," he said. "I'm interested." "Good. The first meeting is scheduled for Monday morning. My office will send you the details." She paused. "Officer Shepard, I should warn you, not everyone will welcome your participation. Some will see you as a traitor to the department. Others will question your sincerity, see this as opportunistic rehabilitation of your image." "I understand. And you're still willing to serve." Michael thought of Marcus Washington, of all the unnamed, unseen people he had stopped over the years, based on nothing more than bias disguised as instinct. "Yes, Mayor, I am." After the call ended, Michael stood in the kitchen, processing the unexpected turn of events. The path forward was beginning to take shape, not a return to what had been, but something new, something challenging, something necessary. He took out his phone again and sent a text to Washington. "The mayor has asked me to serve on a new police reform task force. I've accepted. The work begins." The response came a few minutes later. The beginning is often the hardest part, but it is only the beginning. A week passed. The media frenzy around Riverdale began to subside, though the underlying issues remained very much alive in community conversations, in city council meetings, in the daily operations of the police department under interim Chief Johnson's leadership. Thomas Washington had extended his stay, taking up residence in a small rental cottage rather than the hotel. His presence in town had become a catalyst, a reminder, a silent witness to both past injustice and possible transformation. Eleanor Hayes divided her time between her university duties and the growing Unanswerable Questions project, which had expanded to include community dialogue sessions, data collection initiatives, and policy development workshops. Sarah Shepard had become one of her most dedicated volunteers, her keen mind and passionate commitment making her a valuable asset despite her youth. The Police Reform Task Force held its first meeting, a tense affair, as officers, community representatives, and city officials navigated the uncomfortable terrain of acknowledging systemic problems while seeking constructive solutions. Michael's presence was met with mixed reactions, cold shoulders from some fellow officers, cautious appreciation from community members, skeptical assessment from legal experts. Through it all, a delicate web of connection was forming among people who might never have engaged with one another under different circumstances. People united not by easy agreement, but by a shared commitment to difficult truths. On a quiet Tuesday evening, Michael received a text from Washington. "The cemetery tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. There's something you should see." The dawn mist still clung to the headstones when Michael arrived at the cemetery the next morning. Washington was already there, standing beside Marcus's grave, with a stillness that suggested he had been there for some time. "Justice Washington." Michael greeted him, approaching with respectful steps. Washington nodded acknowledgement, but did not speak immediately. His gaze was fixed on the headstone, where someone had placed a small frame photograph of a young man with bright eyes and a warm smile, Marcus alive and full of promise. Today would have been his 30th birthday. Washington finally said, his deep voice soft with contained emotion. Michael felt the weight of those words, of the life unlived, the potential unrealized. "I'm sorry," he said, knowing the inadequacy of the words, even as he spoke them. Washington nodded slightly. "I used to imagine what he would have become. A lawyer, perhaps. A judge eventually, following in my footsteps." True. A trace of sorrow edged into his voice. "Now I wonder if he would have chosen a different path. one that might have changed things more fundamentally than I've been able to. Michael wasn't sure how to respond, so he remained silent, standing a respectful distance from the grieving father. You've attended 2 meetings of the task force now, Washington observed, changing the subject. What are your impressions? Michael considered the question. There's resistance from some officers from parts of the department leadership, but also openness from others. And the community representatives are passionate, knowledgeable. There's potential for real change. If the momentum isn't lost, Washington noted, if the difficult conversations continue when the media attention fades. Yes, Washington turned to face him fully. That's where you come in, Officer Shepard. Your role isn't just to serve on this task force, but to ensure its work continues, deepens, transforms the department from within. I'm trying, Michael said, but it's not easy. Some officers won't even look at me in the hallway. They see me as a traitor. And how do you see yourself? Michael thought about this, formulating his answer carefully. As someone who was blind but is beginning to see. As someone who has harmed others through that blindness and wants to make amends. As someone who believes the system can be better than it is, but only if we're honest about how broken it currently is. Washington studied him, something like approval in his gaze. That's a good beginning. But only a beginning, Michael acknowledged. I know. Washington nodded, then reached into his pocket and withdrew an envelope. I received this yesterday, he said, handing it to Michael. From your son. Surprised, Michael took the envelope. Inside was a letter handwritten in James's neat script, Justice Washington. You don't know me, but I was in the patrol car when my father stopped you last week. I witnessed it all and said nothing, did nothing. I've been struggling with that silence ever since. I wanted you to know that I've decided not to become a police officer as I had planned. Not because I think police work is inherently wrong, but because I realize now that I need to understand justice more deeply before I try to enforce it. Your son Marcus has been on my mind constantly. I've read about him, about his life, about his death. I can't imagine your loss, but it has changed how I see the world, how I understand my own responsibility within it. I don't know if forgiveness is possible for the system that failed your son, for the officer who took his life for my own silence in the face of injustice. But I want you to know that Marcus's story will guide my choices going forward, that his life, though cut tragically short, continues to create change. With deepest respect, James Shepard. Michael looked up from the letter, emotion tightening his throat. I had no idea he had written to you. It arrived yesterday, Washington said, a thoughtful reflection from a young man at a crossroads, not unlike Marcus at his age. Does it help? Michael asked hesitantly, knowing that Marcus's story is changing lives, changing paths. Washington was quiet for a moment, considering. It doesn't fill the absence, he finally said. Nothing can do that, but it gives meaning to the pain, purpose, to the memory. He gazed at the photograph on the headstone. Marcus was always concerned with fairness, with justice. Even as a child, he would advocate for others, stand up against bullies, question authority when he saw inconsistency or hypocrisy. A soft smile touched Washington's lips, the first genuine smile Michael had seen from him. Once, when he was perhaps 7 or 8, he organized a protest on the playground because the teachers were enforcing the rules differently for different children, made signs, recruited classmates, presented a list of demands. I was called to the school, of course. Of course, Michael echoed, smiling slightly himself. The principal expected me to discipline him, Washington continued. Instead, I asked to see his list of demands. They were remarkably well-reasoned for a child his age. Clear examples of inconsistent rule enforcement, specific requests for reform, a system of accountability. The smile faded. I was so proud of him, for seeing what was wrong and trying to make it right, for believing that change was possible. The weight of loss settled over them again, the father remembering the son who would never grow into the man he might have become, the officer confronting the system that had taken that future away. Your son's letter, Washington said after a moment, suggests he has that same quality, the ability to see injustice and feel compelled to address it. That's rare and valuable. Thank you, Michael said carefully, refolding the letter. I'll talk with him about it when I get home. Washington nodded, then turned back to the grave. I've been offered a speaking position at the Judicial Reform Conference next month, he said. They want me to address racial bias in policing, in the courts, in the entire system of justice. Will you accept? I'm considering it, Washington replied. For 15 years, I've worked within the system believing that change happens through careful, incremental reform, through reasoned arguments, through persuasive dissents, through gradual shifts in judicial thinking. He paused, his gaze distant. But sometimes I wonder if that approach is too slow, too cautious, too respectful of a system that has not earned that respect. What's the alternative? Michael asked. Washington looked at him directly. That's the question I've been wrestling with, and the answer I'm considering might surprise you. What is it? Silence, Washington said simply. Not the silence of acquiescence, but the silence that forces others to confront uncomfortable truths. The silence that transforms into a mirror reflecting back what we've become and challenging us to envision what we might yet be. Michael thought of the memorial service of Washington, standing in silent witness of others rising to join him, a wordless confrontation more powerful than any speech. It worked here, Michael acknowledged, at the memorial service. It changed things. Yes, Washington agreed, and perhaps it could have a similar impact on a larger stage. He fell silent, then his gaze returning to his son's grave, to the smiling photograph, to the life cut short by a system that had failed in its most fundamental obligation, to protect all citizens equally, to serve all communities justly. Michael stood with him, sharing the silence, understanding for the first time that some truths were too profound, too painful for words, that presence itself could be a form of testimony more powerful than any verbal declaration. The morning sun broke through the mist, illuminating the cemetery in soft golden light. In that moment of shared silence, something shifted between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition of shared purpose, of common ground, in the difficult terrain of justice and reconciliation. The Police Reform Task Force had been meeting twice weekly for a month when the breaking point came. The discussion had turned to the department's use of force policies, specifically the training officers received around perceived threats and appropriate responses. Michael, still suspended, but actively participating in the task force, had been reviewing training materials, comparing Riverdale's protocols with best practices from departments nationwide. What he found disturbed him deeply. Our training materials consistently emphasize officer safety over civilian safety, he explained to the group. They train officers to perceive potential threats in ambiguous situations rather than to de-escalate those situations. Interim Chief Johnson nodded. That's standard in many departments. Officer safety is paramount. But at what cost? Michael pressed. When we train officers to see threats everywhere, to trust their instincts, without examining the biases that inform those instincts, we create the conditions for tragedy. He distributed copies of a case study he had prepared, an analysis of Marcus Washington's shooting 15 years earlier. This case illustrates the problem perfectly. Michael continued, aware of the tension building in the room. A 15-year-old boy reaches for his phone. The officer trained to perceive threats sees a weapon that isn't there. The result is irreversible, devastating. Captain Rodriguez, a veteran officer serving on the task force, pushed the case study away. This is ancient history, Shepard, and it was investigated thoroughly at the time. Miller was cleared of any wrongdoing. Was he, Michael challenged, or was the investigation itself part of the same flawed system? The same bias that saw a phone as a gun, saw a justified shooting rather than a preventable tragedy. You're out of line, Rodriguez warned. No, Michael said firmly. I'm finally finding the line. The line between protecting officers and protecting the community, between maintaining the system and transforming it, between accepting comfortable lies and confronting uncomfortable truths. The room had gone very quiet, the tension palpable. What exactly are you proposing? Chief Johnson asked, her tone neutral but her gaze sharp. A complete overhaul of our training around threat assessment, Michael said. De-escalation as the primary goal in all encounters. Explicit recognition and confrontation of implicit bias. And most importantly, a shift in how we measure success, not by arrests made or citations issued, but by peaceful resolutions, by community trust built by harm prevented rather than force applied. Rodriguez scoffed. Utopian nonsense. We deal with real threats, real dangers every day. Yes, Michael acknowledged, but we also create dangers where none exist. We escalate situations that could be resolved peacefully. We see threats based on appearance, on neighborhood, on the color of someone's skin, rather than their actual behavior. He met the gaze of each person around the table. I know because I've done it for years without ever acknowledging it to myself. And I can't go back to that blindness, that denial. None of us should. The meeting continued for another hour, the discussion heated but substantive. By its conclusion, no consensus had been reached, but the framework for a new approach to training had been established, one that would prioritize de-escalation, recognize bias, and measure success by different metrics. As they were gathering their materials to leave, Chief Johnson approached Michael. "That was brave," she said quietly. "Challenging, but necessary." "Thank you, Chief," Michael replied. "I know it puts you in a difficult position." "Leadership is about difficult positions," she observed, "about making hard choices for the right reasons." She studied him for a moment. "Your suspension review hearing is scheduled for next week. Have you thought about what comes next for you? If you're reinstated." Michael nodded slowly. "I have, and I'm not sure returning to patrol is the right path. Not immediately, at least." "What are you thinking?" "Training," Michael said. "If we're going to change the culture, it has to start with how we train new officers and how we retrain existing ones." Johnson considered this. "It's an interesting idea. The department does need a new training officer." She gave him a measured look. "It would be challenging. You'd face resistance, skepticism, perhaps outright hostility from some quarters." "I know. And you'd still want to pursue it." Michael thought of Washington, of their conversations, of the silver badge that now sat on his dresser, as a daily reminder of promises made and promises kept. "Yes," he said, "I would." Johnson nodded. "Good. We'll talk more after your hearing. In the meantime, keep pushing for those changes. They're overdue." As Michael left the meeting, he checked his phone to find a text from Katie. "Sarah just told us Justice Washington has been invited to speak at the Judicial Reform Conference next month. They want you to speak as well. Call me when you can." The invitation arrived formally the next day, an email from the conference organizers requesting Michael's participation in a panel discussion titled "Confronting Bias in Policing Personal and Systemic Transformation." Michael sat at his kitchen table, staring at the screen, a mixture of emotions washing over him. Fear, uncertainty, a strange sense of rightness despite the discomfort. "Are you going to accept?" Katie asked, reading over his shoulder. "I don't know," Michael admitted. "It's one thing to speak truth here in Riverdale among people who know me. It's another to stand on a national stage to expose my flaws, my biases, my failures to the world." "It's vulnerable," Katie agreed. "But maybe that vulnerability is exactly what's needed. Not just policies and procedures, but human beings acknowledging human failings and committing to human growth." Michael nodded slowly. "Washington will be there. The Justice Department, law enforcement leaders from across the country. It's intimidating." "Yes," Katie said simply, "and important precisely because of that." Michael considered this, then began to type his response. "I would be honored to participate in the panel discussion. While I don't claim any special expertise or moral authority, I can offer my personal journey of recognition and the beginning stages of transformation. If that perspective would be valuable to the conference attendees, I am willing to share it openly and honestly." He hit send before he could reconsider, then turned to Katie. "Well, that's done." She smiled, pride evident in her expression. "You've changed, Michael, in ways I wouldn't have imagined possible a month ago. For the better, I hope." "Definitely for the better," she confirmed. "Though not easier, change rarely is." Michael thought of Washington, of the pain that had shaped him, of the justice he still sought 15 years after his son's death. "No," he agreed. "Not easier, but necessary." The day of Michael's suspension review hearing arrived with a crisp autumn chill in the air. The leaves had begun to turn, painting Riverdale in rich golds and reds, a reminder that change, while sometimes painful, could also be beautiful. The hearing was closed to the public, but the results would be announced at a press conference afterward. Michael had prepared his statement carefully, with input from Katie, from Sarah, from James, even from Thomas Washington, who had offered his perspective during their increasingly frequent conversations. As Michael entered the municipal building, he noticed a small crowd gathered outside community members, holding signs that read, "Accountability Matters," and "Courage over Comfort." Among them, he recognized Sarah and Eleanor Hayes, standing shoulder to shoulder with other volunteers from the Unanswerable Questions Project. Sarah waved when she saw him, her expression a mixture of encouragement and determination. Michael waved back, drawing strength from his daughter's unwavering support. Inside the hearing room was arranged formally a long table where the review board members sat a single chair facing them, where Michael would present his case. To his surprise, Interim Chief Johnson was already there, talking quietly with the board chair. She approached as Michael entered. "Officer Shepard, good luck today." "Thank you, Chief," he replied, unsure what else to say. "I've submitted my recommendation to the board," she continued. "Based on your work with the task force, your willingness to confront difficult truths, and your potential contribution to departmental reform." Michael nodded, grateful but still uncertain. "I appreciate that, Chief. Remember," she said, lowering her voice slightly, "whatever the outcome today, the work continues. The real measure isn't whether you get your badge back, but what you do with it if you do." "I understand," Michael assured her. The hearing proceeded with formal precision. Michael presented his statement, an unflinching acknowledgement of his biased policing, a commitment to personal and professional transformation, a vision for a department that could serve all community members with equal respect and protection. The board asked pointed questions about his traffic stop of Justice Washington, about his admission to Chief Miller afterward, about his subsequent recognition of patterns in his own policing history. Michael answered honestly without defensiveness, accepting responsibility, while also contextualizing his actions within the larger system that had trained and rewarded them. When asked about his plans if reinstated, he outlined his interest in reforming officer training, in explicitly addressing implicit bias, in changing how success was measured and valued within the department. "And if you're not reinstated," one board member asked, "what then?" Michael considered the question carefully. "Then I'll continue the work from outside the department, through the task force, through community organizations, through whatever platforms are available to me. The badge is a symbol, a tool, but the commitment to justice transcends any single role or position." The hearing concluded after 90 minutes. As Michael left the room, Chief Johnson approached again. "Well said, Shepard. The board will deliberate, but regardless of their decision, I want you to know that your voice has already changed things within the department. That matters." "Thank you, Chief," Michael said, genuinely moved by her words. Outside, the crowd had grown larger. Michael spotted Katie and James, who had joined Sarah and the others. And standing slightly apart, observing rather than participating, was Thomas Washington. Michael approached him, aware of the cameras capturing their interaction, of the symbolic weight of their public connection. "Justice Washington," he greeted him. "I didn't expect to see you here." "The beginning of change should be witnessed," Washington replied simply, "even if the witness remains silent." Michael nodded in understanding. "Have you decided about the conference? Whether you'll speak or maintain your silence there as well?" "I have," Washington confirmed. "But that's a conversation for another time. Today is about your journey, not mine." Before Michael could respond, the doors opened behind them as the review board members and Chief Johnson emerged. The crowd quieted, anticipation rippling through the gathered observers. The board chair stepped forward, facing the assembled press and community members. After careful consideration of all factors, including Officer Shepard's statement, Chief Johnson's recommendation, in the broader context of departmental reform efforts, the board has decided to reinstate Officer Michael Shepard effective immediately. A murmur ran through the crowd, surprise, approval, some skepticism. "However," the chair continued, "this reinstatement comes with conditions. Officer Shepard will not return to patrol duties at this time. Instead, he will serve as a special advisor to the chief on training reform, working directly with the Police Reform Task Force to implement new approaches to officer preparation and continuing education." The announcement concluded with procedural details, but Michael barely heard them. He felt Katie's hand slip into his, felt James's supportive grip on his shoulder, saw Sarah's proud smile from where she stood with the project volunteers, and he saw Thomas Washington, still observing, still bearing witness. Their eyes met across the crowd, and Washington offered a single subtle nod. Not approval exactly, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. Recognition of a step taken, a commitment made, a possibility embraced. The beginning, not the end of the hardest work. Arfim, the Judicial Reform Conference was held in Washington, D.C. on a crisp November day. The agenda included presentations on bail reform, sentencing disparities, jury selection bias, and a special panel on confronting bias in policing, featuring Thomas Washington, Michael Shepard, and experts from academia and law enforcement. Michael arrived early, his nerves evident as he reviewed his notes in the empty conference room. He had been preparing for weeks, working with Eleanor Hayes to frame his personal experience within the larger context of systemic reform, to balance accountability with hope, criticism with constructive vision. Thomas Washington arrived precisely on time, immaculate in a tailored suit, his presence immediately commanding attention despite his quiet entrance. "Justice Washington." Michael greeted him, rising from his seat. "Are you ready for this?" Washington regarded him thoughtfully. "Are any of us truly ready for transformation, Officer Shepard? We can only commit to its possibility, its necessity." Michael nodded, accepting the wisdom in those words. "Your silence has been powerful," he observed. "I've been wondering if you'll maintain it today or if you've decided to speak." "Both, perhaps," Washington replied enigmatically, "in their proper moments." The conference hall filled quickly, judges, attorneys, law enforcement officials, community advocates, policymakers. The panel moderator welcomed everyone, introduced the speakers, and outlined the session's focus on practical approaches to recognizing and addressing bias in policing. Michael spoke first, sharing his journey from unquestioning confidence in his own objectivity to uncomfortable recognition of his biases, from defensive resistance to active commitment to change. He outlined the reforms being implemented in Riverdale, the new training protocols, the revised metrics for evaluating officer performance, the community oversight mechanisms. "This work is painful," he acknowledged toward the end of his presentation. "It requires us to confront truths about ourselves, about our institutions, about our society that we'd rather not see. But that pain is the beginning of healing, of transformation, of justice that serves all communities equally." Other panelists followed, offering research findings, best practices, challenges, and opportunities from their various perspectives. Throughout, Washington sat in attentive silence, his presence a reminder of both the personal costs of systemic failure and the potential for meaningful change. When it was finally his turn to speak, Washington approached the podium with deliberate steps. The room fell completely silent, the anticipation palpable. He stood for a long moment, gazing out at the assembled experts, practitioners, and advocates. Then, without speaking, he placed a small sign on the podium, the words clearly visible to the audience. "If justice must see color before it can act, is it justice at all?" The question hung in the air, challenging, provocative, essential. Washington remained silent, allowing the question to resonate through the hall, forcing each person to confront it individually before any collective response could dilute its impact. After a full minute of this powerful silence, he finally spoke. 15 years ago, my son Marcus was shot and killed by a police officer who saw a threat that existed only in his mind, in his bias, in his fear. Marcus was reaching for his phone to call me, to tell me he was on his way home." Washington's deep voice carried through the hushed room. His last words were, "Dad, I'm coming home soon." He paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle. "For 15 years, I have worked within the system, believing that change happens through incremental reform, through reasoned argument, through careful persuasion. I have written opinions, issued dissents, advocated for policies that might prevent other fathers from experiencing my loss." Washington's gaze swept across the audience, making each person feel individually addressed. "And yet, just weeks ago, I was stopped by a police officer for no reason other than driving while black in my hometown, the very town where my son died. 15 years of reform, of advocacy, of work within the system, and the fundamental biases remain unchanged." He gestured to Michael, seated among the panelists. "Officer Shepard had the courage to admit his bias, to confront it, to commit to changing not just himself, but the system that shaped him. That courage is rare and valuable, but it should not be necessary. Justice should not depend on individual courage, on exceptional moments of recognition. Washington returned his attention to the sign he had placed on the podium. If justice must see color before it can act, is it justice at all? This is the question we must answer not with policies or procedures alone, but with a fundamental reimagining of what justice means, what it requires of us, how it manifests in our communities. He fell silent again, allowing the question to resonate once more. Then with quiet dignity, he returned to his seat without further comment. The moderator, visibly moved, struggled to transition to the discussion portion of the panel. The questions from the audience were thoughtful, challenging, engaged evidence that Washington's words and his strategic silences had created the space for deeper consideration. As the session concluded, Washington and Michael found themselves side by side accepting thanks and further questions from conference attendees. "Your approach was powerful," Michael observed during a brief moment alone. "The silence, then the personal story, then the fundamental question." Washington nodded slightly. "Some truths must be experienced before they can be understood. Silence creates the space for that experience." "What happens now?" Michael asked. "When we return to Riverdale, to the daily work of reform, to the resistance and the slow progress," Washington considered this. "Now we continue, without illusions about how difficult the path will be, but also without despair about its possibility." He met Michael's gaze directly. "Forgiveness is not the end of pain, Officer Shepard. It is the beginning of the most difficult pain, the pain of transformation, of growth, of becoming something new." "I understand," Michael said, though the full weight of those words would take years to fully comprehend. As they parted ways, Washington to another session, Michael to a meeting with law enforcement leaders interested in Riverdale's reforms, each carried with them the awareness that they had begun something significant. Not a resolution, not a conclusion, but a process that would require sustained commitment, ongoing courage, unflinching honesty. The work of justice, the work of transformation, the work of healing wounds too deep for easy remedies. The beginning, not the end, of the hardest journey of all. 3 months later, Thomas Washington stood in the empty courtroom of the Supreme Court. The day's proceedings had concluded. The justices and staff departed, leaving only the solemn dignity of the space itself. He moved to the center of the room, where he placed his fedora on the main lectern. Beneath it, he left a simple card with the words that had guided his recent work, his evolving approach to justice. "Not everyone needs to be heard, but one person who dares to be silent at the right moment can change an entire society." Washington stood for a moment, contemplating the symbolism of the gesture. Then he turned and walked away, his steps echoing in the empty chamber. Outside, reporters waited, eager for comments on the Riverdale reforms that had begun to attract national attention, on the Unanswerable Questions project that had expanded to communities across the country, on the police training model developed by Michael Shepard that was being adopted by departments nationwide. But Thomas Washington moved past them without comment. His silence, now a recognized form of communication in itself, a refusal to simplify complex truths, to reduce profound transformation, to sound bites, to separate justice from the lived experiences of those who sought it. In Riverdale, Sarah Shepard led a workshop for high school students, teaching them to recognize bias, to question authority constructively, to envision justice that served all communities equally. On the classroom wall hung a poster with the question that had sparked a movement: how many people must remain silent for one person to be unjustly suspected? Across town, Michael Shepard conducted a training session for new officers, challenging them to examine their instincts, to recognize their biases, to commit to protection and service that transcended personal fear or cultural conditioning. On his desk sat the silver badge Thomas Washington had given him, a reminder of promises made and promises kept, of the gap between acknowledgement and action, of the ongoing work of transformation. And in the Riverdale Cemetery, fresh flowers adorned Marcus Washington's grave, not just from his father but from community members who had come to understand that his death was not just a personal tragedy but a call to collective action. The white lilies, the Constitution book, the fedora, symbols of loss of principle of dignity in the face of injustice, and now symbols of possibility, of change, of the beginning of something new. Not everyone needed to be heard, but those who dared to be silent at the right moment, to witness rather than lecture, to embody truth rather than merely speak it. They could indeed change an entire society. One moment, one recognition, one transformation at a time. The unavoidable gaze of justice looking directly at those who claim not to see color, even as their actions proved otherwise. The silence that transformed into a mirror, reflecting back what we had become and challenging us to envision what we might yet be. The forgiveness that marked not the end of pain, but the beginning of the greatest pain of all, the pain of growth, of change, of becoming something new. The beginning, not the end, of the hardest journey of all, the journey toward justice.